Courtesy of the SCP Foundation, from the Tales of Mr. Collector. This is Mr. Clank Part 2 by Dr. Gears. Creative Commons licensing and full artist credit are in the description. Mr. Clank woke suddenly, as he always did, a squealing gasp rising from his lips as his eyes ratcheted open. The endless walls and towers of the city loomed like the walls of an oubliette. A few damaged and sputtering gas lamps, the only light along the grimy, uneven street. Mr. Clank stretched, moaning as the flywheels and screws refused to catch, missing their sockets several times before clicking in. His twitching, sputtering arms ratcheting down, chest piston wheezing out of sync with the pitted key. He turned his head, slowly, shivering as timing gears missed, confused about where he had gone, why he had gone there. The thin, gray flesh of his face and legs looked icy, but the squealing of his joints took his mind from it. He hardly noticed the thin, black fluid his feet were leaking as he started his jittering march. Hours later, he might have been standing still. Mr. Clank felt claustrophobic, the endless walls seeming to shrink after every turn. Mr. Clank ran in a shuddering lurch, unaware of the time, sure he was late. For what? He wasn't sure. The thread of thought scattering as he saw something point at him, its face a black, fuzzy pit. Mr. Clank was lost, his clockwork squealing and sticking deep in his brain, an oily bile leaking from his mouth unnoticed as he panted. Mr. Red was there. Mr. Red had been there? Mr. Red was coming. He whimpered in time to the slipping key, refusing to look behind at the squealing sound far behind him. Mr. Clank tripped and fell, skidding into a heap of oozing garbage, lying there, too exhausted to move. His gearworks locked tight, bringing a soundless scream, then let go, only to lock again moments later. Mr. Clank whimpered. For help, or release, he wasn't sure, feeling a dimness seep up from the cracked road. Mr. Clank woke suddenly, as he always did, crying ashy tears as his eyes slowly clicked open. The twilight was real, bloated. Boiling sun framed around trash fires and burning oil on the open plain. Mr. Clank screamed thinly, trying to cry as his rusted, pitted frame ratcheted up in a squeal of frozen bolts and rusty haze, trying to grit his teeth against the balcony, against the agony. He found his lower jaw was gone, his exposed teeth dry and brittle in the thick air. The city walls were an unbroken wall behind him, his path from there forgotten, his way forward a stumbling, slow-motion shamble among slag, burning oil lamps, and shifting trash. Forward. His legs dug in on worn spines, steely points fogging rust. Forward. Hours later, Mr. Clank lay twitching and clicking. At the edge of the pit, night had fallen like a slimy sheet, smothering vision, thought, and breath in an oily tarp. Time was passing over him like ants. Mr. Clank lying like a dead thing, moaning in a raspy squeal as he watched the searing sun. Mr. Red was waiting, needing, missing, wishing, listening. The words were shards, jabbing and freezing his stripped and sputtering gears. Sparks hissed and arched, a belt stretching and going slack. The memory of his breath coming in torturous, moaning gasps. The pit. Mr. Clank twitched and flexed, trying to get in, but his eyes glazed, frozen in a blank stare, watching the slow undulation of the road. Mr. Clank woke suddenly, as he always did, crying ashy tears as his eyes slowly clicked open. Mr. Clank woke suddenly, as he always did, lidless eyes fixed on the pulsating walls. The blackness was total, and yet he saw. His body hissed and squealed, a paralyzed mass, brassy orbs mocking sight from the massive screws. The rust was gnawing, cancer, rats in his skin, maggots in his nerves, an endless itching with no arms to scratch. The paths forward and behind were obscured, frozen eyes fixed on the leaking, sore-ridden flesh of the ceiling. He hated the softness under him, hated the easy, slick fluid dripping and seeping, hated the flexibility, hated with a mass that had moved beyond feeling. Hours later, he dropped like a numb, dead stone, landing on a heap of hissing, sputtering hulks. The darkness defied even his endless eyes, the vague humps of rusty, crumbling metal rolling in a sea of black pus. Mr. Red. Mr. Red. The squealing notes arose in a croaking monotone. He had taken, given. It did not happen. There had been silver, there had been gold, there is rust. Mr. Clank raged, strained, snapping and shuddering as he flexed out, clawing a helpless rage into the fleshy floor, digging for the bottom, for the escape, for the end, for the road. Mr. Clank woke suddenly, as he always did, and refused to open his eyes.